When I say Australia, you probably think of kangaroos, sandy beaches, and an ever-growing economy. The kangaroos and the beaches, they've always been there. But the economy, well, it wasn't always booming. Most people remember the early 90s fondly. Not Australia, though. At the start of the decade, the country faced a period of economic regression. In 1 year, Australia's GDP fell by 1.7% and unemployment increased by 3.4%. But that was just 1 year in the 90s. Why are we talking about it now? It's not like it's coming back. It's not, right? Unfortunately, it might be. Although Australia's economy had been growing since the 1990s, that only continued until the end of the 2010s. In the last 5 years, we've seen its per capita GDP growth rate in negative figures twice. 2020, we could blame COVID-19, but 2023, that decline only foretells the worst. It's not just the economy that we should be worried about. Inflation is at an all-time high, and the worst of all are the real estate prices. It's harder for Australians to acquire a home today than it ever was. The Australian dream is now just a dream, and many young Australians are starting to believe that it will stay this way.
So it's very frustrating, and what I'm seeing is a bunch of politicians putting politics first, second and third, when actually they should be putting politics to the side and letting our government get on with the job of helping Australians with their housing needs.
Australian dream. Housing in Australian cities is different from that in most developed cities around the globe. Polls show that Australians strongly detest living in high-rise apartment complexes and prefer suburban residentials instead. So they keep expanding cities, making them bigger and less dense. If you try doing this in countries like India and Bangladesh, you'll quickly face the problem of land scarcity. But that isn't a problem for Australia. The country is the 6th largest on the planet, but has a population much less than just the city of Delhi. This makes Australia one of the least dense countries on Earth and leaves it with a considerable amount of empty land. Cities are also far, far away from each other. For instance, Perth's major closest city is Adelaide. Until recently, this abundant land allowed cities to just keep expanding. A rising population was no hurdle for the Australian dream. For most Australians, buying a house in the suburbs was never difficult. But since the start of the 2020s, things haven't been the same. To buy a house in Melbourne today, you need an annual income of around $170,000. In places like Sydney, this number jumps to over $260,000. And if you think this is accompanied by better median income and wages, then no. The median income in these two cities is around $100,000. Look at this house in Kensington, a Sydney suburb. No electricity, no kitchen, 4 bedrooms with no functional bathrooms. It was sold for $3.5 million. For comparison, mansions like this and this in Austin are listed at a relatively lower price. Why are rental prices out of control? Renting in Australia is more challenging than ever. Every rental place receives hundreds of applications and rents have skyrocketed. And why is that? One answer that most Australians would agree on is immigrants. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, take a moment to subscribe and click on the bell icon so you don't miss out on any of our videos. Now, immigrants are essential for the economy. They fill the gaps in the labor force left by the local market, especially in a country like Australia, where the fertility rate ranges between 1.6 and 1.8. COVID forced Australia to stop immigrants from coming in till 2022. The then Australian Minister for Home Affairs said that in the following years, Australia would have to increase the migrant influx so the gap made by COVID could be overcome.
In COVID, it was right to shut the borders and our migration rate was effectively zero. Coming out of COVID, we are playing a bit of catch-up. We've got serious labour shortages and it's probably inevitable that we will run a slightly larger migration program over time.
Yes, Claire, Australia did need a slightly larger program, but the key word here was slightly. The total number of migrants who came to Australia in 2022 and 23 was 510,000, which is more than twice the number of migrants who came to the country in 2018 to 2019. This brings us to an obvious question.
So this is one issue, it's the short-term element. How can the country handle that many people coming to the country from a housing and infrastructure point of view?
No, a country cannot handle this many immigrants from a housing standpoint. Welcoming over 500,000 immigrants in 1 year was, in fact, inviting the housing crisis that Australia now faces. However, immigrants aren't the only ones who caused the rental crisis. If you ask the Student Accommodation Council of Australia, immigrants are being unfairly blamed for the crisis.
We can see that started happening in 2020 when there were no international students in Australia due to COVID. So as international students have returned, people have started to say, well, it's their return which is driving rent and availability, but we know it's far more complex than that.
So if it did start in 2020, then maybe she's right. Maybe immigrants aren't the only ones to be blamed. And yeah, it's not like only the rentals are going up. House prices are also unrealistically high. And as immigrants rarely buy a house to live in, maybe the biggest reason for this housing crisis is something else. Yes, although it's true that the number of houses being built isn't enough for the migrants entering the country, the housing crisis is much more complex and has to do with something else. Tax incentives. The Australian government offers negative gearing. If you aren't aware of this term, don't worry. It's a unique concept that for most of time was only found in Australia. Today, a few other countries have also adopted this. Those countries include Japan, Germany, Norway, and Canada. Negative gearing is when an asset produces less revenue than the expenses spent on it. That loss on one asset will be deducted from the rest of the personal income for the taxpayer, reducing the total tax money. For example, if your personal income is $100,000 and there's a rental loss of $20,000 on one of your properties, that loss will be deducted from your income, which means you'll be taxed only on the remaining income of $80,000. This concept was first introduced in 1936 by the then Governor-General of Australia, Richard Casey. At that time, purchasing a home involved financial risks, and this served as a backup for that, attracting people to invest in housing. It was removed once in the 1980s and was brought back soon after as the nationwide protests broke out. While negative gearing might sound good on the surface, in reality it only helps the already rich citizens, as the middle class don't already own rentable properties. Negative gearing not only drains the national economy, it makes owning a house much more attractive than it already is. The housing market gets more expensive and, historically, older people tend to benefit, continuing to lower the success rate for young Australians of today. While some people these days believe that negative gearing does more harm than good, it still remains an untouchable sacred cow in the books of Australian law. Just look at how the Australian Prime Minister responds to a question about a change in negative gearing policy.
Will you consider revisiting negative gearing policy ahead of the election?
No.
So you're completely ruling it out?
I think that was a pretty clear answer.
So how come more older people own homes while it is difficult for the young people? One of the answers to this question is the super fund. For starters, the super fund is almost the same as the IRA, except the process for the IRA is very difficult. On the other hand, the compulsory super or superannuation is compulsory in Australia, and the process is easy. If you're an employer, the law binds you to start super funds for all of your employees. You simply put 11.5% of their salary into their super account that they will be entitled to after their retirement. Also, the percentage for super fund, 11.5%, is for today and is not fixed. This percentage is called Super Guarantee Rate, or simply SG. Here's a table that shows how SG has changed over the years and its future values till 2029. While the super fund is important to help people secure a better future after their retirement, it is beyond our understanding why Australia holds negative gearing in the middle of a housing crisis. Why can't it be removed, or at least changed? Is there a personal bias?
Labor's refusal to phase out billions of dollars in property investor tax concessions to property investors like yourself is denying millions of renters the chance to buy a home.
This allegation was based on the fact that Anthony Albanese himself owns 3 properties that can be negatively geared. We don't know how true or untrue this allegation is, just like we don't know if Australia will ever come out of this situation. But to get out of a crisis, politicians must come together. Something that has not happened yet.
So it's very frustrating, and what I'm seeing is a bunch of politicians putting politics first, second and third, when actually they should be putting politics to the side and letting our government get on with the job of helping Australians with their housing needs.
But let's not blame the opposition only when the government is so stagnant in negative gearing. We can't forget how Anthony Albanese responded to the question of the change in negative gearing policy. All in all, Australia stands at a pivotal crossroads, where the once bright Australian dream is increasingly overshadowed by economic challenges and a unique housing crisis, one unlike any other in the world at the moment. The interplay of rising property prices, stagnant wages, and government policies like negative gearing complicates the path for young Australians aspiring to home ownership. A nation that can't retain its youth won't be able to retain its future. So, Australia needs to act quickly before driving away the very population that it needs in order to grow. What are your thoughts on the current housing crisis in Australia? Do you believe it's a result of government policies, or are there other factors at play? How do you think young Australians can overcome the challenge of home ownership in today's market? Let us know in the comments.